From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Dan O'Brien discusses the grain price trends in the wake of last week's USDA grain supply and demand report, noting the effect of grain movement disruptions caused by that hurricane, and he'll talk about why he still believes that you row crop producers will have favorable post-harvest selling opportunities. And then for you, an extended visit with K-State's Mary Knapp, with her retirement today capping off her 40-year career. She'll reflect on how far the resources of the Weather Data Library here at K-State have come during that time span, and some of the exciting things ahead in weather information gathering capabilities. Mary also, for the last time, covering the Kansas Agricultural Weather Outlook for us on Agriculture Today. You are tuned in to Agriculture Today, and good to have you aboard once again for our Friday edition, which opens up on the grain markets. And across the way this week is K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien. And just for starters, reflecting back on last week's USDA grain supply and demand report, Dan, the lingering effects of that have been overshadowed by other things, by and large.
Well, yes, the USDA came in and projected a crop just basically 15 billion bushels, a little bit higher acreage numbers. So that had an effect on the market for a little bit of time. But then I think the impact of Hurricane Ida closing off export shipments came into play and probably had as much or more impact on the market as that had done. So that affected corn, affected soybeans for sure. Well, it affected all these crops, and you can see it in the shipments that the USDA shows from the Foreign Ag Service numbers. In that the last bit of time here, really, for corn shipments of about 7.5 million bushels, for soybeans about 8 or 9, and reports of China, who normally be coming to the U.S. at this time because of extreme tightness of supplies in Brazil and Argentina, in essence went ahead and bought extremely high-priced grains down there in the last bit of time just because of lack of availability and challenges. Now, we have had reports of those ports opening up. We kind of get that on a daily basis. So that's been a positive thing. And I would say when you stand back and look at the trends, first in corn futures, East corn had dropped down to about $4.95 thereabouts, closed yesterday at $5.29.5. So that Hurricane Ida did have some impact, but we sort of returned to I guess the base of where we've been since about April of this year, with a high of about $6.40, a low of just about $4.98, and hanging around about $5.25, $5.30. Given up the ups and downs of all of that. Now, it is interesting that when you look at the, I guess I call it a measure of continuous pricing over time for corn futures, it does look like, at least from a technical point of view, that we have signals that would indicate, we're heading towards a harvest low. Well, some would say, well, gee whiz, Dan O'Brien, you're sitting here middle of September and you're saying, well, I think we've got a harvest low. Well, but at least we see some confirmation of that in terms of applying technical analysis. In essence, when you look at the 7, 21, and 42-day weekly closes for corn, you've got a kind of a longer-term situation where we've broken down lower. And it would make sense now. Harvest is just around the corner, et cetera. The USDA projected a pretty good-sized crop. And even with that, we're seeing a harvest low, and we're trading at about $5.29, $5.30. So we've certainly been worse off than that. We've seen 350s and 375s, and I guess a pretty common occurrence when we get in other regular crop years and come to this point in time.
But to add to that, looking at your notes this week, for new crop now, the export outlook is more to the bullish side?
It looks a little bit more positive. It seems that on a weekly basis that, Hurricane Ida had an impact, but we have the bulk of our crop coming just around the corner, and anticipation, well, for instance, in terms of total sales projected for a new crop starting September 1st of this year, in essence, we're about 39% of the way sold to meet the USDA's projection of about 2.475 billion bushels, and we're just a couple weeks into the marketing year. So there's a lot of anticipation of what's coming in October and November, and buyers really looking towards filling their needs with lower prices. That's for corn. For grain sorghum, it's interesting. We have had really just pretty low grain sorghum exports, and like 100,000 bushels here since the start of the year over the last 2 weeks. But yet, the USDA's projection of 320 million bushels to come about. So a projection of 320 million bushels, and we're raising a crop, somewhere in the 350 to 400 range. So just about everything we're aiming to, that we're going to grow, or a good chunk of it's aimed by the USDA, or at least thought will go towards exports. I would add one more thing in. When you look at the world situation and look at world minus China stocks to use for corn, in 2017-18 marketing year, we were at 14% stocks to use at the end of that year. 2018-19, 12.7. The next year, 2019-20, down to 12.3. In this the marketing year we just finished, we're down to 9.9%. And then they tick up a little bit to 10%, but that's almost all of that has to do with, well, of course, anticipation of a decent crop in the U.S., but really a strong recovery in South America. Well, they're pretty dry in those planting areas. And we'll be paying attention in the corn market to what happens in South American plantings now as we head into October, November, December. And as you and I talked about last week, they're in the midst of a La Nina situation. They're dry down there. And so even though there's a harvest coming on, anticipation of the world rebuilding stocks, still you have a lot of uncertainty as to whether South America is going to be able to come through to the degree that the market seems to be anticipating.
And those drought influences, both domestically and abroad, apply too over on the soybean complex.
Yes, they do. Of course, there's one major soybean crop in South America, and it's kind of spread out because of their north to south territory that they're covering. We had gotten down in 2018-19, we were about 39% stocks to use without. China had dropped in 19-20 down to 27, 24, 25% this last marketing year that we just finished up on August 31st. And our projected, even with some recovery, down to 24.5%. So just a little bit different situation than corn. And in fact, if anything's being talked about, it's that for a set of production reasons and finance reasons, et cetera, domestic market issues that South America, if anything, is trending a little bit more towards corn of late than they are soybeans. So got all that. And the same longer-term weekly continuous soybean chart pattern is coming about as we talked about in corn, where it does seem that we're heading towards harvest lows. And again, what a bold statement here, but there's some confirmation of that. So if you have harvest lows, then the question is, well, what happens after that? I think that we must have one-track minds in the grain market because we see the harvest here. Well, yes, that's good, and we hope it's a good harvest for farmers, et cetera, but those are buying opportunities on the export side. And for people that were anxiously wondering what type of supplies they we're going to have this year when we head to the lower side during our harvest months, I'd anticipate strong buying by the grain markets in response to that. So how does that show up? If the overall future, say, D's corn, November, beans are, in the midst of harvest, and that's the narrative of traders, and that's where they're going to bid on the future side. So if there's something else that's happening, then you probably look to local basis bids for elevators that are filling trains or at barge locations, et cetera, and look for bids. So I would wonder about that.
Well, as we keep returning to the topic of drought, that's applicable too in the wheat market now, and dryness, as we've known all along here in the northern plains in Canada. But now we're starting to edge into winter wheat planting season here in this region, and lo and behold, it's also parched in quite a few places here too.
It is, and our colleagues at KSU have been talking about that from the agronomy side, and reports of people being quick to plant, maybe even quicker than some of our agronomic recommendations would say. Prices are good. I think we ended up with a $7.05 crop insurance price, which is certainly a positive development. I think the wheat market is showing surprising strength as well. Again, following the pattern that we'd seen, particularly in corn, where we came down lower and came back some. For wheat, we got down here within the last week or so to about $6.75 for D's Kansas hard red winter wheat. and are about 45, 50 cents higher, about 720 and a half on yesterday's close. And so you wonder, well, where'd that come from? That we had, for the week ending September the 9th, just under 19 million bushels of all U.S. wheat exports. And we need a pace of about 17 to meet the USDA's projections for this marketing year. And we're about 15 weeks into it. For hard red, we had just under 8 million bushels and need to be at about 7.3. So that was strong. Even hard red spring at 4.8 million bushels, we need a pace of about 3.3 to meet the USDA's projections. So again, there are issues around the world. Russia's issues, some dryness emerging now in Australia, other challenges, et cetera. Just would add in also that this trend of ending stocks to use for the world minus China shows up also for wheat, if anything, all that much more. So in 2017, we were at 25% stocks to use world minus China, 23.6, 2018, 23.7, 2019, 23.5, 2020, 21, and this year projected to be about 22. So several years in a row where we have declining, tightening world stocks. It's just really supportive that coming out of that last USDA report, we dropped the projection of ending stocks to use down to 621 million bushels, below 30% stocks to use. Wheat, as a food grain primarily, when you get below 30% stocks to use, you're starting to get the type of excitement that you see when you drop corn below 7, 8, 10. It's a big thing when we drop to levels like that.
Well, Dan, all of this lending to no dull moments in the markets, day to day, week to week. We appreciate you keeping track of all of it for us and reporting right here. And he does collect many thoughts on these trades in his weekly notes. Of course, we direct you to those at agmanager.info. We'll talk again next Friday. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, Dan O'Brien with us, opening up this Agriculture Today. We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and indeed today is a momentous occasion for many of us here at K-State and many of you who have been regular listeners to this broadcast, especially on Fridays. After a 40-year career here at Kansas State University, our guest now is calling it good and retiring this very day, the 17th of September. And you'll know who we're talking about. Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. The word's been out, Mary, that you're calling it a career, and congratulations to you, first of all.
Thanks. I appreciate all the good wishes I've had from both my colleagues here at the university and around the state, and it's nice to be able to move on to a new point in my life, but still know that the Weather Data Library will continue. They're actively recruiting to fill my position, and so hopefully there will be many more years where the listeners can reach out to the university and find the weather and climate information that helps them make their decisions.
Absolutely, but we're not letting you out of the door without visiting a bit with you about your career and about climate. Of course, those go hand in glove. The Mary Knapp story, well, you grew up not far from Manhattan.
Yes, I grew up in Junction City. I went to St. Xavier's High School. It was a college preparatory school, basically. We did not have any ag classes, but I spent a lot of my summers in northern Iowa, where my grandfather had a corn and hog farm. And so I got interested in agriculture through that. Of course, in the 70s, acquiring land was almost as challenging as it is today. So I regretfully decided I wasn't going to actually get into production agriculture. But I came to K-State to study agronomy, and I chose agronomy because it has a very broad perspective. You can go from crops to animals when you talk about range management. And so having that broad perspective allowed me to explore a lot of areas of agriculture.
So at what point did you narrow it down to climatology?
Well, that wasn't until after I got back. When I graduated at K-State, I went into the Peace Corps for 2 years, and I worked as a rice extension agent in the Dominican Republic. You might think, well, rice is kind of far-fetched for a Kansan, but it was kind of prophetic because we actually have been doing rice research in the state in the past years. While I was there, I experienced my first hurricane and got that introduction. But again, it became very apparent how the weather and climate influenced agriculture. And in a very short distance, the two rice fields, I was working at a land resettlement project, and the two fields were less than 5 miles apart, but the varieties that were best suited in one area were not in the other. The difference was one area was constantly wet. It was water from mountain runoff that kept that in as more of a swampy area. So the soils were colder. They had different characteristics. The second one was a little bit further away from the mountains, and it was basically rain-fed. And again, the soil temperatures tended to be warmer. There were periodic dry periods. So again, a whole different dynamic. And again, we're talking about a very short distance between the two stations.
So you were inspired then to return to the States?
I came back to the States just at the Christmas holiday time period, saw an advertisement in the Lawrence Journal World for a research assistant in the entomology department at K-State. And I'm going, I'm really an agronomist, not an entomologist, but I'll go interview just to practice my English.
Close enough, right?
Close enough. And it turned out it was a very good match. I worked with Dr. Fred Poston and Steve Welch. They were working on modeling the European and southwestern corn borer, which is a big pest in corn, or was at that time. And, of course, they needed somebody to manage the insect colonies and the fields that they were doing their research in, as well as growing corn to feed our insect colonies during the winter. So I got to keep with my agronomy background and add in more information on the entomological side of it. But because they were doing that growth development model, weather was a critical component of that model. And so I started working, again, integrating the weather information into the decisions and the performance of the crop models.
And then you gravitated more and more toward the weather/climate side?
Yes, I did. In the mid-'80s, computers were being introduced as a desktop tool, which might be hard for some of the listeners to fathom, but when I started out, there was no desktop computing capability. You had a deck of punch cards that you would take over to the basement and run through the computer to get your output. So I moved into extension at that time, and we were working on decision-making tools for agriculture. It was called the Pro Series. Corn Pro, Beef Pro were two of the products that were developed at that time. And then about the 88 time frame, Dr. Bark, who was the climatologist at the time, was approaching retirement, and he wanted to ensure that the weather data library and the weather and climate information continued to be archived and shared with the citizens of Kansas. And he felt that extension would be a good fit for that. So he moved over into what was then the computer systems office in extension, and I started working with him. One of our first tasks was to move data from paper and microfilm into a digital format that would be more easily accessed and utilized.
It seems medieval now, doesn't it, when you think back on that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. We have big cabinets full of huge reels of tape that you would read off the data from. And the data was collected through the National Centers for Environmental Information, which was at that time the NCDC. But you couldn't get online and pull that data. You had to transcribe paper copies or pull off of tape or assemble in other ways. And we've made tremendous headway in making that data more available, and the more available that information is, the more useful it is in planning and decision making.
So you made the move permanently to the Weather Data Library, taking over for longtime climatologist Dean Bark, around 1991, in that ballpark?
In that ballpark, yeah. And at that time, I became the acting state climatologist. I had undergrad students working for me, but I was basically a one-person shop at that time. We also had the seeds of our mesonet. There were 13 automated weather stations that were around the state at the various research and extension fields. So Colby, Tribune, Garden City, Heston, and St. John, both of which are no longer active fields, but we still have instrumentation near those areas. And changes in that area were pretty dramatic as well. Back when the stations were first deployed, we had a phone line that ran out to the station in the middle of the field so that we could connect and call and download the data. We didn't do it on the 5-minute interval that we do now. We did it once a day, but we had hourly and daily data. So that was kind of the roots of our current mesonet system.
Well, the landlines had their pros and cons, didn't they?
Landlines were pretty interesting. Again,
they were vulnerable to certain things.
Vulnerable because, again, we're talking about being out in the middle of the field so that you had adequate exposure for your station, and you can readily imagine what kind of problems might occur, broken lines, all sorts of things like that you had to track down and figure out what was happening with that particular station.
You settled into that position, and one thing before we take a break, because we haven't really dived into this before, there is a difference to point out to folks that don't understand between a climatologist and a meteorologist, right?
Right, and that difference is blurring now as we come into the current time period, but a meteorologist is usually looking at current events, the synoptic data, what kind of forecasts they might have for the upcoming weather, and that sort of thing, whereas a climatologist generally is looking at long-term weather patterns and how those might influence what develops down the road, whether it be a month or a year or 10 years.
And on that score, over the years, you've become quite the weather/climate historian, and we want to talk about that. Mary Knapp is with us. Once more, a tribute to her today. She is retiring from Kansas State University on this day, and we'll talk more with her about her career and how she perceives the next generation, if you will, of weather information for you producers and others. We'll be back in a few moments. This is Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Welcome back. Eric Atkinson with you, devoting our time today in large part to a visit with K-State Research and Extension climatologist Mary Knapp. Once more to remind, Mary is retiring today after her 40-year career here at Kansas State University. One of the real hallmarks of your career with Extension, with the Weather Data Library, has been your willingness and success in outreach, not only through this medium right here, but you have been prominent on all sorts of field days and other allied events, and just want you to reflect on that a bit. You've always enjoyed interacting with people.
Yes, it's always been a fun part. You learn quite a bit about what is important, both to the producers and to the public, when you participate in those outreach events. So it's not all one-sided. It's finding out what is it that makes a difference in their activities. I especially enjoyed working with the young groups, and I've had presentations to those as young as preschool, all the way up through high school and college. And again, having that interaction might spark an interest for a future meteorologist or climatologist to continue the efforts in the field.
How many extension meeting rooms, how many wagons at a field day have you been on sharing climatological information.
Yeah, it's countless. I really couldn't keep track of how many of those that I've actually participated in. So there have been quite a few. And again, they've run the gamut from the field days at the research sites to our participation in the wild weather exhibit at the exploration place in Wichita. And again, bringing the climate and weather information not just to our agricultural audience, but to our urban audience as well.
You really loved working with those kids, whatever venue it was, and introducing them to the field.
Right. It's always fun to work with the younger group and see what kind of questions they come up with and how enthusiastic they can be about what you're trying to show them.
Everyone quite literally has some level of interest in the weather and in climate trends. Now, climate's a predominant topic in our society. Obviously, it's also so on a global scale. What would you like people to know about climate that perhaps they aren't familiar with or it gets overlooked in the dialogue?
Well, there's two things. One is one of the most frequently discussed topic is what are normals? And for the U.S., what we talk about for climate normals are 30-year averages that are updated every 10 years. That was started back in the days when massaging data and calculating averages was much more difficult, as we alluded to earlier in our show. So they wanted a time period that was manageable, but they wanted to update it on a regular basis. So if there were cycles in the weather, it could be captured. Right now, we're using the 1991 to 2020 time period to look at the normals. And the normals serve as a benchmark for what current weather is compared to what it has been in the recent past.
Weather history did not start in the 1800s.
No.
That often gets forgotten.
That often gets forgotten, and it's not a European-centric idea either. If you look at it, the very first rain gauge networks were in China, where tax advisors were looking to document the rainfall so they could assess whether or not the yield reports were accurate. And that was in the BC era. So again, a very old pattern. And we can look at our indigenous populations in the U.S., and you can see records of weather and climate events and things like the winter count and other documentation or oral history. And one of the interesting parts has been translating that knowledge into a modern perspective so that we can look at how those records fit into our understanding of the climate and the environment.
That long view on climate is so highly important. I want to keep that in mind. And before we take our break and actually do business talking about the weather outlook, you mentioned the Weather Data Library. Its growth continues. Mesonet, likewise. What's on the horizon in the weather information field that enthuses you looking forward?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, again, our ability to retrieve and archive data has increased leaps and bounds. So now we have, instead of 13 stations, we have over 70 stations on our Mesonet. Instead of just hourly and daily data, we are collecting that 1 minute as well as 5-minute and hourly data. The number of parameters that we're measuring has increased and continues to increase. So now we have soil moisture monitoring as well as barometric pressure and temperatures at two different heights, wind at two different heights. Again, increasing the available data to feed into those models that I was referring to. Mm-hmm. Another thing that's very interesting is our new satellite capability. Again, going back to the 80s, we had limited coverage of the satellite. Now the new GOES system has tremendous capability, both from a photographic standpoint, but also from the amount of information that they can pull, looking at satellite soil temperatures and soil moisture to satellite-derived rainfall information.
It's really dazzling, the technology.
It is dazzling, but that doesn't negate the need for continued on-ground in situ measurements, both from the electronic form, but back to our basic original observation technique of manually recording temperature and precipitation, because that helps us validate the information that we're getting from that satellite so that we can see, yes, this makes sense, that it follows the continuum that we would expect. Another network that we have been using and we've been working at expanding is the COCORAS network, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. The listeners participate in monitoring the weather and climate, and it's suitable from the very youngest who can go out and check that rain gauge to the very oldest who are out there looking, well, how did that compare to 40 years ago at this time?
If you'd like to participate in COCORAS, by the way, contact the Weather Data Library at K-State. Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension, with us, and we'll return shortly here on Agriculture Today. We're back now on Agriculture Today, and as promised, a look at Kansas agricultural weather for the final time. K-State climatologist Mary Knapp to do the honors here of telling us what we can expect out of our weather patterns in the weekend ahead and beyond, courtesy of the Weather Data Library information at her disposal. And this past week, Mary, was not exactly an escape from summer either.
No, it wasn't. We had some very warm temperatures. A number of locations in western Kansas that topped the 100-degree mark, actually hitting 106 degrees, which is very toasty for this time of the year. But we also had a couple of readings that were down at 47 for our low. So, again, indicative of the dry conditions that we have in place where you can have those really wide temperature swings.
And it's been largely dry?
It has been largely dry. There was some rain at the end of the period. We had slightly above average rainfall in the east central part of the state. The east central was the area that had the most moisture. The western areas did see some rain, but we're generally looking at less than 1/10 of an inch. So that was not what we need. When you look at the report that Romulo Lolato put out, the optimal planting date for winter wheat is from the 1st of September to about the 30th of September in that northwest corner. And there simply isn't the soil moisture that would be desirable to get that wheat in the ground and up in a timely manner.
Producers are starting to ask questions about that. And soil temperatures are starting to factor in here too, aren't they?
Right. You ideally would want the soil temperatures to be a little bit on the cooler side. We're still looking at average soil temperatures in the 70s, which is a little bit warmer than you would like for that germinating wheat. We are seeing those decrease a little bit. A couple of things come into play. We have had, as I mentioned, at least a little rain, but also the sun angle is declining and we're having fewer hours of sunlight, so that slows that warming of the soils and get those cool nights, and we can have those temperatures drop off at least moderately in the next couple of weeks.
Well, then what is the drought monitor telling us this time around? Has it intensified again?
It has intensified and it has expanded. Abnormally dry conditions have returned to the southeast. Again, typically they would expect to get more moisture, and when they don't get it, things go downhill very, very quickly. Probably not as unfavorable in that area where corn harvest is in full swing as it would be in the west where they're trying to get ready for wheat planting. You've got a bigger window in that southeast corner for timely planting. This early to mid-September is really too early for planting in that region. There was also some expansion in the southwest and west central and intensification of the severe drought in that northwest corner.
Heading into the weekend, then, doesn't sound like there's much promise for moisture, at least in the immediate term?
No, not really. There are scattered chances of it, but the amounts are not really impressive. We're looking at generally less than 1/4 of an inch in the areas that do get rain. Again, that's not going to go very far to moisten the soil profile to get it ready for that wheat planting. More encouraging is as we move into midweek next week, temperatures are going to moderate. They may still be warmer than normal, which is what the outlook is, but we're talking highs in the 80s instead of highs in the hundreds.
And we're talking lows into that 50-degree range?
That is on the horizon. Again, as we go into the fall and we're moving past the midway mark in September, average temperatures drop about 2 to 3 degrees a week. So at the end of September, our average high and low temperatures are much cooler than they were to start September. So you can, again, be warmer than normal without being particularly hot.
And the extended forecast to finish out the end of next week and take us through the remainder of September, what's the general gist of that?
The general gist of that is warmer and drier than normal, which again is not encouraging. And unfortunately, the newly released October outlook is also pessimistic. It's favoring warmer and drier than normal. And again, we're looking at the fact that October is generally drier than September, so missing the mark on October precip is not going to help address the deficits that have accumulated. But again, you don't have to hit 100 degrees to be warmer than normal in October. The last quarter of the year, October, November, and December, also favored to be warmer and drier than normal. One reminder to our listeners is that that's the 3-month average. Mm-hmm. If we have a particularly warm and dry October, we could have a cold, wet December and still be warmer than average and drier than average for the season.
And the same could be said, narrowing it back down to that month of October outlook, that there may be a day or two of decent moisture in there. One hopes, anyway.
We could hope. And again, if we get timely rains, it may not make it up to what we would normally expect, but it may be enough to get that winter wheat started for the winter.
Right. Very good. Well, Mary, it has been a distinct pleasure. You have been with us on this broadcast for 20 years, and speaking for all who have appreciated your contributions and the information that you've shared all around the state of Kansas, many thanks to you. Wishing you all the best in your forthcoming retirement, and looking to see you around once in a while at certain extension functions as well. So once more, we deeply appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciated having this outlet because it has been the envy of climatologists around the country to have that connection to the producers in the field.
We wish you all the best. Mary Knapp, climatologist, K-State Research and Extension. Again, if you didn't catch it earlier, she is retiring as of today after 40 years of service to Kansas State University, the last 30 of those as a climatologist with the Weather Data Library here at K-State. That is our time for today and the week. We wish you the best this weekend. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.